ahead, Jackson, please. You can start the recording.
Okay, it started now.
Okay. Okay. So as I mentioned, my piece to discuss with all of you this morning is about conducting literature reviews. You might think that it's as simple as just going on Google or ChatGPT or PubMed, whatever people are using these days, and just doing a search for a topic that you may be interested in. But there's actually a whole science behind doing literature reviews the right way. So I want to walk you through just the basic tenets of literature review science, and then you can ask questions. There are whole courses taught on how to correctly do literature reviews. So if this is a topic of interest to you, we can talk about getting you more information too. But I also feel that working with a faculty member in the center who are experienced in doing these literature reviews will give you the hands-on experience is just as valuable as doing a class or a lecture. Okay, so one of the main tenets of literature reviews is they're not all the same. They're actually very different types. So here is just an example. The gold standard is what we call the systematic review, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about that this morning. They can or cannot include a meta-analysis. Some do, some don't. The gold standard would be including a meta-analysis, and that's actually data that's been captured across all studies that are included in the review. Scoping review is another one you'll see commonly in the literature that may not have as rigorous a methodology applied to it as a systematic review. And then some other ones that you'll see are rapid review, literature review, integrative review, and so on. But by far, journal editors, if journals even allow systematic reviews to be published, editors prefer the higher rigor for obvious reasons. Okay, so as I said, we're going to start sort of at the top with, and this is broadly applied, it can be applied to public health, but also clinical science, or really any field of science that you're interested in. So as I said, the systematic review is the gold standard for rigor and effectiveness assessment. So if you can, my advice would be to start with the gold standard. Be easier to publish and a good exercise to do just for your own skill set. Second is a scoping review. Sometimes there's a formal approach to addressing the breadth of what's been done in the field, mapping the research. There may be cases where a systematic review cannot be done. It may be an area of science that's so new that there is no good data, or the heterogeneity of the data across studies that have been done is so much that it's impossible to do a comparison, and certainly impossible to do a meta-analysis. So a scoping review is the next best thing. So here's where you're mapping the research, maybe onto a new theoretical framework or from a theoretical framework, one of the constructs. That's often where you see scoping reviews applied. And then third most common is what we call a narrative or literature review. And that's just a very generic summary or overview of a topic. This is where you'll all start, even with your papers that you're working on this summer with your mentors. This is your first step to your introduction, and going in, scraping the PubMed or other databases for basically what's been done in the field. Because to write a high quality paper, you need to be building on the science. So you need to know what's already been done. You obviously don't want to reinvent the wheel and redo somebody's studies that have already been done, but you also want to be comparing and contrasting the findings you have in your paper with what has been done already in the field. And typically you'll find that what your analysis is showing, some of it may agree with previous studies, but probably not all of it. And that's pretty typical. Okay, so for systematic reviews that include a meta-analysis, it really does require a team. You cannot do this alone. And typically a librarian or somebody who has a PhD in library science is involved in this. And yes, library science is absolutely a thing. So we're very lucky in the UT system that we have resources within our libraries where you can reach out and effectively partner with one of their library scientists to conduct a high level systematic review. And this is always the first step I require for any of my mentees, is that if possible, we bring in a library scientist to the team, because then I know the rigor of the methods is going to be, we're going to be held honest to that. And then it typically involves content experts, people who are already experts or leaders in their field, are probably leading the systematic review with trainees to discover what, not only what has happened and what has been found in a certain area of their field, but also what are the gaps and what are the opportunities to advance the field moving forward. And then finally, for a review that includes a meta-analysis, a statistician is involved, because there are statistical methods, meta-analyses, that are applied. So you really should have a card-carrying statistician on the authorship team also. So characteristics of this level of review: very focused research question, and typically it is one question only and not several, just because, you know, depending on the question too, the scope can be huge. If you said, for example, in my field, what is the effectiveness of childhood obesity prevention interventions in early childhood? And so I could come up with probably hundreds and hundreds of papers that somehow cover that question. But if I just add another couple of words on and say, in the child care center setting, that is going to direct and probably limit those studies down significantly, because then you've eliminated pretty much all of the clinical and other setting options. Other characteristics, you definitely want to be rigorous, and any of the methods that you write about in your review should be reproducible. So any other research team can pick up those methods and apply them and find out exactly the same results. They're not getting 200 more studies included or 200 less. They should have the exact same number based on the search terms. Critical appraisal of the work. Again, this is going to be peer reviewed if you're sending it to a journal. So you want to be thinking about that level of rigor for the paper too, that any other experts in the field can review this and say, yes, this is good for review, fills a gap in the field, important work. And then finally, clarity and precision. You want to, again, when you're writing the methods section of how you came up with the studies that you did, be very clear and precise about exactly what search terms you used, and we'll discuss that in a few minutes too, so that any of the review itself can be reproducible. That's really, really important. Science in general is moving in this direction more and more, even for just classic studies. Journals are asking now more to share the data set, share the code, share the statistical approach, and so on, so that any team could come in behind you and apply your methods on top of the data set that you have and reproduce exactly the same results. That's what should happen. So how do we start doing a systematic review? The methodology is obviously first you want to develop a research question and a protocol. So most systematic reviews don't have to get IRB approval because they don't involve human subjects. However, I often will have my mentees, there's a whole database called Prospero where you can register a review. And there you can check and see and make sure that nobody has developed and is actually moving into a protocol stage where they're formally conducting a review and analysis on exactly your same research question. And if you find that, oh, yikes, there's another team out there doing exactly what we want to do here, you can always tweak the research question, but it's much, much better to learn that before you move on to the second step. Because the last thing you want to do is go through the exhaustive exercise of this review and find out, oh my gosh, this has already been published in this journal. So it will be really difficult for you and your team to publish it too. So the second set, okay, you've got the go, Prospero, you've registered your study, you got your team's the only one that is doing this. Now what? Now the next stage is identifying all the relevant evidence and actually doing the review of the science. From there, there is a process of selecting studies for inclusion, and that also is dependent somewhat on your research question, because what will happen when you or the librarian or both of you come up with your exhaustive list of search terms, it's going to pull in a lot of studies. Not all of them will you include, though, because for whatever reason, it may capture studies that the study population is off, the study setting is off, something is off. So you have to go through all of that with rigor and make sure that you're not pulling in studies that have nothing to do really with your research question explicitly. Next step is to assess the quality of each study, a critical appraisal. And this is where you bring in additional team members, and usually it's two people that cross-check each other's work. And there are National Institute of Health criteria, quality indexes that are standardized, that each of you independently will assess and then compare, so that you've got double review and double critical appraisal of what actually you are going to include in the final review, and if you're doing an analysis, that too. So then from there, you synthesize these findings, and you'll see in most systematic review articles that have been published, it's required where there's a flow chart of exactly how the team arrived on the final set of studies that are included in the review and the analysis. And through that whole process, you'll see, okay, we started with this big number based on our search terms, and then we decided that based on this XYZ criteria, we eliminated these studies, and that's how we ended up on our final group that's included here. And then finally, you're going to interpret the findings and present a balanced and impartial summary. That's just goes without saying in science. You can't ever insert your own personal bias or opinion. You are basing the summary findings and discussion of the review on exactly the synthesis of your findings and what has been done in the field. What are all these studies telling you about, if you go back to my example, say the effectiveness of childhood obesity prevention interventions in the childcare centers? What is it? What is the overall effect size? Are these studies actually showing that they are preventing obesity in young children? Okay, so here you can see scoping reviews not as rigorous in terms of the approach. So the case or the operational definition of a scoping review is to you aim to map rapidly the key concepts underpinning a research area and the main sources and types of evidence available. This can be done or undertaken as a standalone project, especially when the area is complex or has not been reviewed comprehensively before. So here in a scoping review, the aims may be different, again, based on your main research question. You can examine the extent, nature, and range of a research activity. Maybe the area, as I said, is so new in the science. This happened very early in COVID too. We didn't have enough data, so you would see scoping reviews on things like what are some risk factors for morbidity and mortality in other infectious diseases, or how could we apply that to COVID as we're moving forward? Here, you'll determine the value of undertaking a full systematic review. If you find, wow, I didn't realize there was so much out there already on this topic, you may want to go right to a full systematic review. A scoping review really wouldn't be that much of a valuable contribution to literature if, in fact, it is a topic that has already received a lot of attention. Here you could also summarize and disseminate research findings, again, often mapping the results or organizing studies into themes. You'll see scoping reviews a lot more in theory or applied to constructs of theories. Maybe you are thinking about developing a new construct for a theory, and you want to see if there are any studies out there that have actually thought about this. What's the evidence to support or not support including that? But there's just not a lot of evidence out there or data where you could apply a meta-analysis. So this is another example where a scoping review may apply. And then finally, identifying research gaps in the existing literature, a little bit more broad than a systematic review. Here, a scoping review, again, is more for sort of early stage areas of science. And then finally, the third level of rigor is the narrative or literature review. And the definition of this is a flexible and eclectic approach can be used for a wide range of diverse studies and study types. This summer, everybody's working on different topics, studies, etc. So your approach may be different. Obviously, the studies that you are going to access are going to be different, and you may go about doing it differently. My first stop is always PubMed, because that is where all really the most rigorous science is published. So that would be my advice, is to start there. Narrative summaries of the evidence written by an expert. So, okay, what do you do when you get all of these studies on PubMed? You've keyed in words that are obviously applying to your research question. You come up with 100 studies. What do you do then? Well, you've got to summarize. You've got to boil it down to no more than a page and a half, typically, maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs, depending on the journal, of what's been done, And then you're going to pull some of those studies through to the discussion of the paper too, to again, compare and contrast. So you don't, and the other challenge here is a lot of journals these days are limiting the number of references that you can include in your paper. So reviews themselves are a great way to get around that. You can umbrella 50 studies in one systematic review and include that instead of including 20, 30 studies individually. So it's also strategic to be thinking about including systematic reviews in your own individual papers too. But there will be cases in your paper, especially in the discussion, depending on your findings, where you're going to want to explicitly pull out studies that may have looked at exactly the same variables that you have, and therefore easy to compare and contrast. I don't think there's two studies in the literature that are exactly the same, nor there should be. So there's always going to be some variation around that, and that's what you should pull out in the discussion of your paper. The questions can be broad or narrow. It depends on the author's expertise. Again, I think this summer, most of you are working on pretty explicit research questions, which is in many ways much easier. It's overwhelming to go with a very broad research question, and I wouldn't even encourage that, especially in this new era of AI. It's really overwhelming, the amount of data that you can come up with very quickly to support a very broad research question. And then what do? It's from there, it becomes even more challenging in how to synthesize that. So methodology for a lit review, there's no strict guidelines here, whereas there really are for systematic reviews. Again, I think your mentors are training all of you in the best ways to go about literature reviews to be as comprehensive as possible. As I said, my first stop is always PubMed. I discourage, actually, my trainees from going into Google search and what we call the gray literature, especially when you're limited with the number of references that you can include in your own publication. Use informal and subjective methods to collect and interpret information. So again, this is where, what do you do once you get all these papers? And there is no one comprehensive or I'd say, almost standardized method of synthesizing a literature review for a paper. It really is dictated by what your paper is and what your paper wants to do, what your hypothesis is even, and your main research questions. However, you should follow some basic principles and guidelines. There's a couple, you can look up at this reference right here. If you're thinking about ever wanting a reference for how to do just a literature review, this could be a nice first stop for you. Okay, so if we look here at, here's sort of a tabular synthesis of review characteristics and comparing a lit review to a scoping review to a systematic review. Obviously, as we've said, they're different levels of rigor, systematic review being the gold standard. So here you can see, first, is a research team involved? As we said, yes, almost always. I can't think of any case where you wouldn't in a systematic review, sometimes in a scoping review, but usually. A lit review, no, you could all conduct your own lit reviews independently. Predefined protocol. For sure, for a systematic review, as I said, if you are going to register this review in Prospero, Cochrane, one of the big databases, you have to have your protocol. That is what is going to be recorded in that registration. Whereas for a scoping review and a lit review, there is no predefined protocol. There's always an abstract involved, all three for sure. It's the same usually as you would see for a standard scientific paper: background, significance, methods, results, conclusions, interpretation. For any journal really that you're gonna go with this review, they always include an introduction. Methods included in the search methodology, always for the review articles, and that, as I said, rarely for a lit review. It's just assumed when you submit an article for publication that you've done a proper lit review. And reviewers who are looking at your paper, this often happens. You'll get a review back and say, hey, you forgot this reference, or you should include this reference. And they're just trying to strengthen the paper, but because there's no methodology involved per se, it's easier to miss things. Filtering, study selection using inclusion-exclusion criteria, always with reviews. This is standard, but again, not with a basic lit review. Data extraction always occurs with both systematic and scoping reviews, but not with a lit review. Charting data into themes. This is where the one circumstance where, again, scoping reviews take lead compared to a systematic review for sure, and definitely a lit review. Meta-analysis would only be involved in a systematic review, and then not always. In fact, I think there's more systematic reviews out there without meta-analyses than with. Results, always with the systematic review, scoping review, you're always going to report the results of the review, but not with a lit review. The lit review is the integration, again, of all the science before your study came along to your study. And then discussion inclusions, always yes, for all three. Okay, so here's an example. If we're going to look at how would we approach a question of, is LASIK or LASIK more effective at correcting myopia? This is just one research question. And so we want to know, what is the right review methodology? So if we look here, we see probably a systematic review could be applied here because it's a very direct research question. Then if we're going to even look at in children ages 1 to 6 years in a community setting, what is the accuracy and various screening methods, alone or in combination, for directing strabismus? So this is a nice also framework for a systematic review, because you could set your tables up where you're looking at the screening methods alone and in combination as separate tables with the literature populating the tables. But a scoping review may ask a question, or answer a question, what are the most effective strategies in managing children with visual and neurodevelopmental disorders? So you can see the difference in this research question. It's a little bit more vague than questions 1 and 2. What is the diagnostic accuracy of HRT, OCT, and GD treatment in detecting these different treatment damages in patients with manifest glaucoma? Again, easily could be a systematic review because it's a very, very direct question. So you could see where you could have tables for each one of these treatment options and the damage that they may potentially cause. And then finally, what are the different types of soft multifocal contact lenses currently available for refractive, correctional, and presbyopia, and to how are they fit? So here, this is much more of a narrative review or something that you could do a lit review for a paper to lead up to even just one or two sentences, because you're going to want to know, okay, what has been done and what are the options already in the field. Okay, so when we do a systematic search, the expectations are expectations of the methods, I should say, are that you're gonna use multiple databases. So it's not just going to be one. It's usually a minimum of 3 and up to 7. These can include not only PubMed, but PsycInfo, Embase, there's legal databases, and so on. So a single well-developed search strategy for each database consisting of author keywords and database subject headings. So mesh headings are key. Medical subject headings. This is how you search. This is how you get the articles you get from your own search terms. So the mesh headings are the crux of all of the methods for a systematic review, because the search has to be reproducible. Remember, we talked about that earlier. Somebody else should be able to come in and apply the methods that you're saying you're doing in your paper and get exactly the same thing. Sometimes, depending on the topic, it may include the gray literature. Gray is the operative word here. That can be things like media, Google searches, blogs, and so on. Hand searching, just going in off of the main systematic review and doing your own hand search. And then cited references from accepted papers, going into other publications and pulling those references out for whatever reason, if they weren't included in your own big search. So again, be prepared, because it's not uncommon that your first grab will include thousands of references. And then the challenge there is to synthesize it down to what you need for your own review. So here's how an example of a search strategy construction. Based on a research question, what is the effectiveness and safety of the treat and extent regimen of anti-VEGF, anti-vitriol treatment in neovascular age-related macular degeneration? Again, another eye-based study. But here, if you look at concept 1, you'll see what are the key words: treat and extend. But then we get to concept 2, you see mesh, okay? Mesh is what I just said, medical subject headings. All of these are coming up as treatment options based on anti-VEGF. So other people ahead of you have keyworded in mesh these different treatment options. And then if you look at concept 3, a database subject heading, you may put in macular degeneration, and then all of these other terms populate. So you can see how quickly a systematic review can blow up just from one very directed research question. So as I said, remember 3 to 7 research databases used for systematic searching. First, I would recommend all of you is Medline or PubMed. That should be your first stop, period. Embase is typically the second one, or Ovid, that you'll see librarians use. And then the Cochrane library, which consists of all reviews, other systematic reviews. So and even now you'll see a review of systematic reviews. So the systematic review literature is getting so deep and wide that they have their own library systems now, and researchers are doing reviews of those reviews. Scopus, Web of Science, Psych Info, I see more obviously in the psychology science. Maybe if you're including some mental health question in your main research question, it's another good one to include. And then Google Scholar as a last stop. I say that because maybe my own personal bias, but the rigor of scientific review and the rigor of the journals. None of this pay to publish stuff is really on Medline. Yes, there are plenty of journals where you pay to publish on Medline, but places like Google Scholar are where everything else lands, and therefore you have to question more the validity and the reproducibility of the science. So my own personal bias is stay away from Google Scholar, some of these other more less rigorous databases, and if you can stick to Medline, then Embase, and then Cochrane Library, Scopus too. So as I mentioned, every journal these days, if they're accepting review articles, pretty much are going to require you to use a standardized flowchart about how you landed and to show how you landed on the final number of studies to include and that you included in the review. So, and there's lots, you do not have to reinvent the wheel. There are lots of standardized forms out there that you can get and just populate with your numbers. So obviously the first step of this is just the identification. What we talked about, that big number that you're going to pull in from the original search from the mesh terms. You will get duplicates, and that's the first sort of low-hanging fruit to get rid of studies. Then you're going to screen from there, and you're going to exclude records, again, depending on what your search criteria is. Maybe it's out of an age range. Maybe it's out of a setting range. Maybe it didn't include your outcomes at all. It happens. It happens a lot, especially depending on the number of studies that you have in the first step. It could be hundreds. And then, finally, you'll whittle it down to the number that are included. But any review that you do, systematic or scoping, always plan on doing this. It's pretty much required everywhere these days. Okay, so the Prisma, I should have mentioned too, that the previous document, Prisma, you should all get used to this term. Put it in your common search or favorites too, because Prisma is a really nice place to shop for documents that you're going to need depending on your study design when you submit an article. They want to know even for non-systematic reviews, the study flow and how if there's randomization, how subjects are randomized, et cetera, and checklists. They give you a really nice prescriptive list of all of the pieces that need to be included in your article, and you have to give the page number of where it's included. So put Prisma in your search bar and start using it and get used to it, because it's pretty much required for any article you submit these days, and it's definitely going to be for a review. So here they're going to ask you on your checklist, okay, in your abstract, did you include the sources search? So those websites we just went over, which ones did you actually include? Did you limit on language? Did you include just English, or did you expand to Spanish, Portuguese? etc., or any other type of restrictions. That has to go in your abstract. And then the start and end dates of searches. You may have done an exhaustive search. You may have not, you may have said any study, any time period, or you, depending on your research question, you may have limited it to say the past 5 years. You want to look at a difference between what's been happening recently versus what reviews found 2 decades ago. But you have to include those dates in the abstract. In the methods, your checklist is going to ask you for, where did you include your database and platform or provider? Again, the start end dates for each database, name of person who performed the search. You will put in initials, but this is very unique to reviews. You typically, in just a regular research study, you wouldn't, in the body of the paper, say who has done what part of the study. You will, a lot of journals these days want to know each author that's included on the paper, how they contributed to the paper. That's a little bit different. They want, then you're going to have to cite where you've done and where included is your complete search strategy and archive of all searches. That's just got to be there in the paper. Okay, so I did mention the term gray literature, and I want to talk about it a little bit just because I feel like, again, we're getting into this era of information overload with AI, and it's becoming less and more murky, I would say, in terms of what's gray literature and what isn't. Number one, it's unpublished. It may be in progress, but it does not have a citation. That's number one. It could be an abstract even from a conference, although I will say I see plenty of people who cite conferences. The higher the esteem of the conference, many of them will have abstract books where your abstract is actually included as a reference. So sometimes you can use that. If it's, again, very early stage, there's not a lot done in the field. Their work, they presented their work at a conference, but they haven't done the full trial, full study yet. Trial registries. So trials.gov, clinicaltrials.gov is where we all go with our big studies to register them. And that's where you put in your whole exhaustive protocol, what you're doing. Not typical to include in a systematic review, but in rare cases you may, if you're trying to answer a question of how many other people are investigating this specific topic. And then contact experts. So this is, sometimes you'll see this in media, where media reaches out to get a quote from an expert and somebody pulls that in, but it's exceedingly rare for a published study. And then research published outside the peer-reviewed journal, theses, dissertations, government reports, those are pretty common, I will say. I don't feel they're as gray. A lot of them, some of them are published in PubMed too. So it just varies by the organization that's publishing the report. And then books and book chapters, much harder to find, not typically in PubMed, but can absolutely be used as references, but are considered gray literature. So if you're going to go with a gray literature, you should have a search plan. And here's where you think about using Google, and probably these days, although I will say ChatGPT, BART, they'll tell you they can't do this for you, that it's outside of the scope of what they do, but I'm sure that's coming. So you could still go to Google or another search engine and put in keywords, just see what you come up with. You can target websites. CDC is a first stop for me a lot of times, because I know they're the ones that are collecting the data that I need, and they're going to have the latest prevalence estimates on my topics that I'm interested in, and they are absolutely legit. So pretty much any US government website is going to be fine. Just make sure that you cite it. And then great literature databases, theses, conference databases, health organizations sometimes have this, even university research. Universities may have a database of all the research that's being conducted at that time. For whatever reason, you may want to search that too. But you're going to want to make sure that you document and record the results of each search process too. It's not the whole process is not as rigorous, obviously, as library science and a systematic review, but regardless, you should always document how you're doing this, because you may get asked. Reviewers may say, well, how did you do this? What was the process? And so, and it's hard to remember once it's completed. So it's always good to record it as you're doing it. Okay, and I just wanted to give you some final tools just for you to have and think about as you are developing your own reviews. Critical appraisal tools, you can check out both of these links. They'll give you checklists of what is expected to be included in all of those reviews to meet rigor and hopefully to get it published. These are standardized and just always a good, nice homework piece to have there for you as you're getting the review ready to go out. Make sure that you've got everything in there to increase its odds of being published. And then peer review tools for search strategies. There's two here too that I included that you may want to use. Caddis and Press. You can look those up on the web too, if you're interested. If, for example, you're not going to end up working with a librarian. I've been told lately, I have one student who wants to do a search and we were queued up, and now she said, well, you know what? I looked this up on the web and I already see reviews, so I'm not going to be involved in this, but I'm going to give you my protocol for how to do the search. And so Caddis and Press are two ways you could do your own if for whatever reason you're not going to be using a librarian. But my first piece of advice is always, first stop is to consult with your librarian. As I said, it's a whole science in itself. I think this shocks a lot of people when they're starting out in their scientific careers. They just think, oh yeah, lit search, that's no big deal. But it actually really is a big deal. And a lot of these systematic reviews get pulled into huge publications in huge journals too, as I said earlier, as a way to circumvent the number of resources or the limitation in resources required by the journal. And here's to link to our library too. Even our own Texas Medical Center library website is just an amazing. It's just got so much information on it to start. So I would suggest even starting there. Okay. Questions? Comments? Thoughts? It's Friday. I get
I
it.
was, no, I was gonna say that I was really impressed by what you mentioned about the library science, and then also for the to find out that the government data and stuff would be considered great literature. And it reminded me of a recent paper I did, where I basically, most of my data was government data, and I was like comparing two different, well, no, I got government data, and then I also did some surveys of this other thing, and I was then also kind of meshing those two together. So I was thinking of what kind of paper that would have been.
Yeah, I think it's a great example. I feel like systematic review questions are getting more and more sophisticated too. They are starting to mesh data with a concept. And so you would have to use a government website, even the Census Bureau in some cases. Say, for example, I know a lot of you obviously are interested in health disparity science, ethnic group differences. Sometimes even for me, my first stop is the census. And finding out, okay, so we just finished a census cycle. So what is the representation of this one group in the US? Because you want to start there and say, use that as justification for why you want to pursue this research question in this one population. So yeah, I think it's a great point. You do have to think about, and it's creative. That's another piece of all of this is being creative in how you apply a systematic review also. And so I think as this whole science develops, people are becoming more creative and pulling in different data. I think there's going to just be, as with everything in AI right now, an explosion of this. We're going to start seeing what came out of COVID were data dashboards. Everybody's using data dashboards now. And so I could see data dashboards being a whole new area pulled into systematic reviews. They were barely used before COVID, but now they're a first stop for even studies that are still going on, like ours in seroprevalence. You know, for a lot of people, COVID is done, but we are still tracking seroprevalence. So you may want to do a systematic review on, okay, how did seroprevalence vary by race, ethnicity? But going to a data dashboard would be a great first stop because some of that may not even be published yet. It takes Jackson knows it's been taking forever to get a lot of these COVID papers reviewed. There's a backlog, there's fatigue, all sorts of reasons. But it can take a year or more to get a paper published. But the data live can be living on a dashboard too. So you're right. I think as long as you can justify it in your search, your mesh terms, you're good to go. Other thoughts? It can be overwhelming. I feel like I always feel overwhelmed when I start a systematic review. I'm like, oh my gosh. And obviously, the more terms you come up with, the bigger that N becomes of studies that are going to be pulled in. So think, and the librarian will be the first one to tell you, think very strategically and logically about what terms you're going to include because it can easily get very unwieldy. And it's a lot of work, even for two people, to screen thousands of studies. It takes days and days to do that. So um, it's another reason to be very strategic on the front end. Put the time in there, really thinking about that. Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of time on the back end going through a lot of studies that aren't going to be applicable. All right. Anything else? Thoughts, comments? All good? All right. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. I'll see you, most of you, on Monday. All right. Take care.
Thanks, Dr. Messiah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you.